consider how you first learned about ADHD. When did the concept of ADHD first enter your awareness? And what were the circumstances around that? Further, when did you first suspect that ADHD might affect your life? Identifying your condition and learning to accept yourself is really tied to a lot of these first conceptions and prejudices that you might have had about ADHD. For example, when I first was learning that people had ADHD and what it was, I had a very negative opinion about those people, the condition, their abilities. And even though those things resonated with my own experience and sort of paralleled a lot of what was going on in my own life, I still judged those things very harshly and had a lot of misconceptions that I wasn't aware of and sort of took for granted. And I think it's important to recognize that whatever we feel uncomfortable with about ourselves is often something that we project onto other people. So if we hate something in somebody else, it's best to look at what we're doing and our own behaviors and see if maybe that's reflected, and that's the reason why it really gets under our skin, whatever it is. If it's disorganization, if it's timeliness, those things are things that you're going to have to learn to love about yourself, and it can be helpful to love that in someone else first and learn to forgive them. It doesn't matter which order you do that in, but compassion is going to be so critical for you to take positive steps in your treatment and in improving your life outcomes. Compassion is a key component in really relieving your stress and forgiving yourself for the mistakes that you will inevitably make as you go forward on this treatment journey. So definitely ask yourself the question, when I learn that someone is diagnosed with ADHD, I assume blank, and fill in the rest of the statement so that you can understand what your preconceptions about ADHD might be. And as far as how you know whether ADHD is a part of your identity, right now it's enough that you suspect it might be, because this course is going to help you regardless of whether you actually have a diagnosable condition like ADHD or not. These concepts are helpful for everyone, but it's definitely geared for those of us with ADHD. So a lot of these preconceptions that you might have about ADHD and a lot of the things that people tend to believe who aren't really familiar on a personal level with this condition come from myths and bad information, sort of these reductive statements that come back again and again about people with ADHD. And some of those terms are here on the right, and they are kind of hurtful, reductive labels that people use, which form the basis of a lot of these harmful myths. But it's important to remember that these beliefs are based in real experiences that arise from symptoms. So these myths come from problems that those of us with ADHD actually encounter. For instance, we have trouble organizing and activating for tasks. We have trouble sustaining and shifting our focus, paying attention to details. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by our emotions. Sometimes it's a struggle to remember things we were told. So a lot of those problems end up being reduced to something that's wrong with the person and not a symptom that they're dealing with. And that's really hurtful, and it makes us feel like we are the condition rather than a person with a condition. So in order to overcome a lot of that hurt and the stress that creates, it's important that we just do whatever we can to reduce that stress. And in so doing, you'll become more aware of your desires, and you'll be able to start taking steps in the right direction. And as you do that and you celebrate small victories and become attentive to the progress that you're making, you'll start to build more and more confidence and strengthen your resilience. And that's going to become a self-reinforcing cycle. As far as the steps that you take towards your big goals, you don't need to overthink that at this point. The important thing is to just appreciate what you are doing. Congratulate yourself for the fact that you became aware of the problems your symptoms were causing, and now you're taking an action. You're at this course. You're listening to me right now. And that's a huge step. That's going to make all the difference in improving your overall life outcomes. Before we move on, I think it's important to just define a couple of my terms. The word neurotypical sort of defines this concept of someone who has no particularly unique aspects to their thought processes and their patterns of behavior based on the structure and neurochemistry of their brain. An atypical, on the other hand, does have some unique differences to this neurotypical brain. This can be defined in a lot of different ways, but ADHD is definitely a part of that sort of large category. And I find it to be a useful term to differentiate us from this kind of illusory, fuzzy idea of normal. And I don't mean that we're abnormal. We're special. And I don't mean that in a negative way either. What I mean is, a neurotypical brain doesn't actually exist. A lot of atypicals start to feel like a sense of grief or longing to be neurotypical, but that's like a horse wishing to be a unicorn. Really, a unicorn doesn't exist, and the same is true of a neurotypical brain or a neurotypical person. We all have something. Atypicals just happen to have something that has a definite name, clear symptoms, and ways to manage those symptoms. So in a lot of ways, we're actually lucky. And so don't get too caught up in grieving the fact that you're not neurotypical, because again, that's kind of an absurd concept to start with, but it does provide a nice contrast to the unique aspects of our own thought processes as people with ADHD. So I'll use the term atypicals to talk about people with ADHD pretty often or commonly going forward.